This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kelsey Andersen Onofre, K-State wheat pathologist, kicks off today's show with a wheat disease update. She talks about Fusarium head blight, leaf spotting, and stripe rust. Continuing today's show is Sandy Johnson, K-State beef reproduction specialist, to discuss producers making sure there is enough pasture for cattle to have adequate food. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show explaining some of the options available to dairy farmers for securing forage in the months ahead. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with a wheat disease update from K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kelsey, wanting to talk about a few different diseases today. However, first focusing on Fusarium head blight, and can you remind us what it is?
Sure. Yeah, Shelby, and thanks for having me again. So Fusarium head blight, as a reminder, is a disease that shows up towards the end of the year in our wheat fields. And it's a tricky disease because it's one that survives in corn residue or crop residue, and it infects right at or after flowering. So unlike some of our other diseases like rust or leaf spots that we'll talk about a little bit later, this disease starts in the residue, infects the flowers at anthesis, but we don't see symptoms for maybe 14 days to even 21 days after that infection happens. So it's really critical for us to watch the weather and also understand our in-field disease risk to decide whether or not we're going to spray a fungicide for Fusarium head blight or scab.
What conditions create the highest risk for scab?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the perfect conditions for scab are when we have wet weather or high humidity right around flowering, right? So unfortunately, over the last several days, we've come into a period of high risk in southeast and central Kansas. So we actually have, and this is pretty nice, there's a forecasting tool where you can map out and see your actual risk on farm according to the weather, and that's at wheatscab.psu.edu. And if you go there right now, you can select your variety, and you can select whether you have a susceptible or a moderately resistant variety, and you can see what your risk is, high, medium, and low, for scab based on your projected flowering date. And you can actually look at forecasted weather up to 6 days from today, right? So if you went there right now, you'd notice that the map is red in south central Kansas and southeast Kansas. So what that means is that we've had conditions that are favorable for scab in both south central and southeast Kansas. So any fields that are coming into flowering right now could be at risk for Fusarium head blight. How do we prioritize fields to spray? Well, one, we need to think about yield potential, right? So we want to protect yield on our highest yield potential fields. Two, we want to check our variety susceptibility, right? So a lot of our varieties are susceptible to scab in Kansas, but there are a couple of varieties like Zenda, for example, Everest, that have slightly better disease resistance than some of our other varieties, right? So those might be in better shape. And then finally, we want to prioritize fungicide applications on fields that are planted after corn. Corn stalks are our highest risk for scab development in our wheat crop, right? So those kind of three factors, right? We need the weather to be favorable. We need to have a susceptible variety. And then if we're planted back into a field that's on or near corn residue, we're going to be at higher risk right now for scab development if we're coming into flowering.
Kelsey, is it fair to say that this is really just making an educated guess almost if a field needs sprayed or not?
That's the really tough thing about this disease, Shelby, is that you can't scout for it, like I mentioned. With stripe rust, it's good because you can get out into the field, you can check, and if you see low levels, that's when you know you need to spray. But with scab, you need to just understand your variety risk, the weather risk, and your cropping history, right? If you've come after a corn crop, and then, it's really kind of your most educated guess. Because the critical thing for scab is that our application window for an effective fungicide is actually pretty short, right? So we have to apply our fungicides during the flowering window, right, which in Kansas can move pretty quickly. So our perfect timing for a fungicide application is that early flowering time. That's peak 10.5.1. That's when we're just starting to see our flowers, right? Our flowers start in the center of our wheat head, and then they'll move up, and then we'll complete flowering at the bottom of the wheat head, right? So when we're first starting to see those flowers, those yellow flowers pop out of our wheat heads, that's the perfect time to apply a fungicide application. The good news is we have a little flexibility, so we can go typically up to 7 days after that flowering window and still have pretty good control, or we could be a little bit early and we can still have pretty good control, right? So we have a maybe 7-day window to really get that fungicide application on when the conditions are favorable. An important thing to remember this time of year, too, is that most of our fungicides have all of our fungicides have pre-harvest intervals, right? And we should just double check what those are for the products that we're planning to spray. So the kind of shortest pre-harvest interval is 30 days, right? So you spray and then you'll need to wait 30 days before you can harvest that crop. But some are based on growth stages, right? So some of our fungicides actually can't be applied before flowering. Some can be applied through flowering, but as soon as we start to fill the berry, we need to stop any application. So again, it's really important to just check some of those labels as we're moving into our later stages of wheat development. The other key thing about a wheat fungicide application for head scab is that not all products will control head scab as well as others, right? So we have some products that are labeled for head scab, like Miravis Ace, Fusarium, Fusarium Pro, Barex, some of our tebuconazole-based products. Those are all the products that we can apply for scab control. We don't want to apply products that have the strobilurin fungicides in them. So those will not provide us the kind of control we need for scab. So this is a good time to double check our fungicide efficacy guide for wheat disease in Kansas. Hopefully you can put a link to that, Shelby, but that'll be a good guide to go back and double check which products we recommend for Fusarium head blight. A good thing to remember is that the products that work well for Fusarium head blight also will work well for other diseases like stripe rust or leaf spots. So you'll get a good kind of bang for your buck if you need to apply that fungicide for scab control. You'll at least get some other control of any other late foliar diseases that will come in this season.
You mentioned leaf spotting diseases, and what do those look like on wheat?
Yeah, so that's another great point, Shelby. So we're starting to see some of those leaf spots kind of move up into the canopy in parts of Kansas. So we have had these wet weather events come through parts of the state over these last couple of weeks, and that's caused these leaf spot diseases, right? So they typically just kind of like their name suggests, right? They look like brown spots or tan spots with yellow rings around them, yellow halos around them. And those are diseases that survive in crop residue. So typically we'll see worse leaf spot diseases in fields that are planted back into wheat stubble, right? But they work their way up from the wheat stubble to your lower leaves. And then when we have these late season wet conditions, they can move themselves up into the upper canopy, into our flag leaves or our flag leaf -1 leaves, and that's when they can start to cause some yield damage. So that would be a good time to do some scouting and check to see if there are any leaf spot diseases that are working their way into the upper canopy. When we do see those move to the flag leaf, for example, we can see a benefit from a fungicide application.
And something we've talked about before this year on Agriculture Today, stripe rust. And do we have a little bit of in Kansas now, Kelsey?
Yeah, so we have seen a little bit of stripe rust. So as we've mentioned in earlier programming, it's generally a low risk year because we've had such low disease levels to our south, but we have had good conditions for infection over the last couple of weeks. So not surprising, we have seen a couple of reports of stripe rust start to come into the state here over the last week or so. We've had a report out of Ford County at very low levels. We had a report out of Labette County at very low levels, and then just most recently out of Cherokee County at low levels. So again, this is a good time to get out into the field, scout, make sure there isn't stripe rust pressure sneaking up on us at the end of the season here. Weather conditions have been good, but the only piece of good news is that we just don't have a lot of those spores coming in from the south. So the risk still remains low, but that doesn't mean we don't need to be out scouting, right? Because there could be some low-level spores that come into the state late in the season and could cause some issues. So it's worth being out in the field, checking for leaf spots, checking for rust, and kind of making an informed decision as we move into the later stages of crop development across the state.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us a wheat disease update.
Oh, great. Thanks again for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. I will link the resources that she mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about pastures as we turn out cattle with K-State beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson. Sandy, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Sandy, before we talk about cattle actually being in the pasture and being taken care of, first, what are some things that people should do before they open up the trailers for their cattle?
Yeah, of course, we need to check those fences, make sure everything is still as we hope it would be. And most people have that as part of their regular routine. But, you know, as we have storms and limbs and things come down, and wildlife can change those, even if we were just there yesterday. So as we turn out, certainly they might explore those boundaries more closely. So just remember that. And obviously having our water sources clean and functional is another important part of that, being ready to receive those cattle.
And Sandy, when we look at a pasture, what are things that producers should look for to make sure that their pasture is going to be able to support their stocking rate or however many cattle they're putting on it?
Right. So that's a good question, and maybe it's not something we can fully describe over the radio, but having a history of how many cattle or really pounds of animals you turn out and what that forage use is over time. So that kind of presumes that you have some indication of how much growth there was and how much you took off. And our rule of thumb we always talk about is take half and leave half. And so oftentimes that half that we left, particularly if we're in a dry year and it's a little slow coming, that's what helps us early in the grazing season if things are a little slow. So if we haven't left half and it's slow, we better wait. And then, of course, depending on the type of forage, we could talk about forage height, but, in Western Kansas, shortgrass country, that's a different height than, brome pastures or fescue in the east. So, you in general, you want to be tracking past use of those pastures, how many animals you've had out there, and when you've used a reasonable amount. And reasonable, I understand we're not defining on the radio, but, you need to track what you've done and make sure that you're leaving enough remaining plant tissue that it can regenerate and grow again. And of course, we can create our own droughts by grazing too closely. The water hits this ground with very little cover on it, and it just runs off. And overgrazing can essentially create its own drought, even if there's adequate rainfall. So that's really something to as we see these fluctuations in moisture, feast and famine, you want to be prepared for that famine. And then when it comes again, you want to collect as much moisture as you can. So leaving residue is really key to that.
Is it important for producers to maybe reevaluate that field every so often to make sure there is enough forage for them to be feeding their cattle adequately?
Yeah, you need to be monitoring, how much rainfall you're getting. And really, we'd recommend a grazing management plan that included, our records from Hayes would indicate that April, May precipitation is a good indication of how much total forage production we're going to get in the year. Now, I'm not sure what the time periods might be for further east in the state, but so what that's saying, if I only get 50% of my normal moisture by the end of May, I need to be thinking about, I'm going to have less forage production, and what adjustment am I going to make? And that may be coming off early, reducing, pulling some off. I might do an early pregnancy detection, pull off the opens, but the amount of forage produced is not going to be the same every year. And so our management should reflect that.
So, Sandy, why is it really important that there is enough forage when it comes to cattle producers wanting to get their cattle bred?
Yeah, as we think about transitioning from whatever their winter program onto some type of grazing situation, and as at times with our, calving season and breeding season, hopefully those cows are in good body condition score at calving, and we are maintaining that body condition after calving and into that breeding season. But what can happen is if we kind of overestimate how much grass is out there or how much rain we might get early, we may not have as much forage as we want to. And usually the quality is okay, but there's just not enough quantity. So they're out working hard to get it. And if you tried to bring them some hay, they'd probably ignore it, but they might not get enough energy because they're working hard for these nice little green pieces that they are finding. And so from a cow energy standpoint, that could have them kind of going backwards from their energy status and delay when they start cycling. And depending on, how that turns out, maybe it rains the next day and we get more grass, or maybe it doesn't rain. We think it's going to rain and we're still waiting and waiting. That can certainly impact the rebreeding performance of those females. And so we need to be aware of that and understand that what they would need is energy, and it would have to be tasty energy, because I've never tried high quality alfalfa on grazing cattle to see if they would eat it. But I know a lot of times in the spring, and you still have them in kind of a trap, and you're feeding them, some forage sorghum hay, and they can chase this little green stuff. You see them eat less and less of that. And you know that it's unlikely they're getting the quantity they need, but trying to get them to eat the forage that you're normally bringing them, they're not doing that. And so we need to supplement with a tasty energy supply. And that would be something like distiller's grains or something in a range cube type of thing to get some added energy. But we hope to not have to go there. But, some type of lick tub protein supplement, that's not going to fix the problem. It's energy, which is pounds.
What are we needing to think about then when we look at those cattle out on the pasture? Do we need to be checking in on them every week, or what's your recommendation?
Well, depending on what your water source is, that water is very important. All right. So if it's solar or a pond, that's going to kind of dictate maybe how frequently you're worried about the water and need to be there. Okay. So they got to have water every day. So make a good judgment there. And then, as a reproductive physiologist, I'm certainly interested in when we turn those bulls out, and especially early in the breeding season, to know that they're getting their job done. We may have had a breeding soundness exam, but we don't test libido. And so we need to make sure that we see those bulls, particularly young bulls, actually complete the mating act, then be following them through the breeding season and nobody gets hurt. Later in the breeding season, activity should slow down. And if activity is still high, that's, raises some flags. And so, there's not some magic number of days, you space out your visitation interval, but that breeding season is very important. And, if one or more bulls gets hurt and you've got nobody out there working for you, that's pretty important in this cattle market to be on top of that. So keep on top of things. It's easy to feel good. We turn them out to pasture, run out and feed them every day. But we can't just ignore them and make sure that that breeding season is going along as we expected.
What are some common injuries you see for bulls that really create issues for cattle producers?
Well, maybe most common might be some type of leg or hip issue, but they can get into all kinds of, they can injure their penis. They can, if they're fighting across a fence, and we got barbed wire things involved, and so you name it, they probably can do it, but they can get into trouble. And I tend to like my bulls in a semen tank. They don't cause me too much problems, but we need those natural service bulls, and we just need to, check in on them from time to time and make sure they haven't gotten into trouble. And hopefully nobody has any trouble with bulls this breeding season, but better still watch out. And
right now we're thinking most spring calving herds are probably have their bulls out or putting them out soon, but anything for fall calving herds to keep in mind?
Well, our fall calving cows probably have been weaned recently, and they generally fare well if they're going out to some native forage system in the summer, pretty good body condition. They tend to start cycling earlier in the fall. So, just making sure that general husbandry needs are met with those fall calving cows. And other than that would be nothing special per se, but hopefully as they're progressing in their pregnancy, they're gaining the adequate amount of weight to have a good body condition score at the time of calving.
Sandy, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Pleased to be here.
That was Kansas State University beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson discussing making sure cattle producers have enough pasture for their cattle as they're grazing. If you'd like to find out more information from K-State's Extension Beef Team like this topic and other topics, you can do that by going to their website, ksubeef.org. Again, that is ksubeef.org. While you're there, you can see who is comprised of the K-State Extension Beef Team, see relevant events that are coming up soon, and possibly subscribe to their Beef Tips newsletter. That newsletter includes topics that are currently happening in the beef industry and also provides other reminders to producers. Once again, that is all at ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk for this week's Milk Lines.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discusses some of the options available for securing forage in the months ahead.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers and encourage them to consider their forage supplies and what they might need to purchase here in the next couple of months, as well as looking down the road as we look into the harvest season in 2025. As I look at our supplies of alfalfa across the state, we still actually have quite a bit of alfalfa hay that's available for purchase. It varies a little bit depending on which location you might be looking at in the state, but in general, we do have a supply of hay that's still in hay barns, as well as some that's still tarped and stacked outside. As we move into the next month or so, we may have the opportunity to buy some of that at a little less price. Sometimes at this time of the year, we do see some declines in alfalfa hay prices as the alfalfa producers try to clear out the barns and the stacks, getting ready for the next crop. However, what I do see in the market is a lot of variability. Seems as though the producers and the buyers are struggling at times to come up with an agreeable price to purchase the hay at, and I think that will probably continue in the next couple of months. One of the reasons that it's likely to continue is the fact that we really don't have a serious drought, but we do have a bit of a shortage of rainfall across most of the state, and we do have some moderate drought conditions that currently exist. Now, this can all change fairly quickly, but at the current time there is some concerns about what our level of forage production might be as we go through the summer of 2025. Well, we can't really predict that, but we just know that it could be a factor. So what are you as a dairy farmer going to do if you're in need of forage as we go through 2025? Well, I want you to consider some things. Number one, maybe an opportunity to plant some summer annuals to extend our forage supply, and you may need to do that, particularly if you have some ground that you're going to harvest wheat off of. Maybe consider growing a second crop. And that second crop might be something like a forage sorghum, or it could be oats or some other crop that you decide to plant that you normally wouldn't. But if you're going to need forage, these types of emergency crops do provide some additional forage for us. Maybe not for the lactating dairy herd so much, but for heifers and for dry cows and those sorts of animals that we have on the farm. It'd give us an opportunity to extend some of our forage supplies. Another thing I want you to be careful of is the fact that with a shortage of rainfall early this spring, some of our cool season grasses have not really taken off and grown very well. So if you're dependent on brome grass for part of your forage supply in your dairy, you might want to consider something else to replace part of that. We still have time, and sometimes we actually do get a decent cutting of brome grass in the fall, but right now, looks like the supply of cool season grasses might be a little bit shorter than normal. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to carefully consider the supply of forages that they currently have on hand and the amount of alfalfa and cool season grasses that they will need to purchase in 2025 to make it through the feeding season of 2026.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, this reminder, Kansas State University and the Great Plains Canola Association are hosting a field day May 14th to highlight winter canola variety development, research, and marketing. According to K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm, the field days are an opportunity to see winter canola variety trials in the field and learn about current and future varieties. He says that management decisions to ensure a successful harvest will be discussed. He notes that questions related to marketing of the crop are still critical. The field day is being held at the South Central Experiment Field, southwest of Hutchinson, beginning at 10 that morning. The Great Plains Canola Association is sponsoring a free noon meal. To RSVP for the catered meal, contact the K-State Agronomy Extension Office at sprite@ksu.edu or at 785-532-5776. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.